My name is Sarah Harris and I am doing a case study on Aime Simard. So to start off, I'm going to give you a little bit of a summary on Simard, just kind of telling you about his life a little bit, where he comes from, where all of his crimes started, all that kind of stuff, everything leading up to his death. So the case of Aime Simard is an interesting one that allows for many questions of the Canadian justice system. Aime Simard was born in 1968 and he was a Canadian outlaw biker and hitman for the Montreal Rockers Motorcycle Club, which is a support club for the Hells Angels. He worked as a contract killer for the Hells Angels and other organized crime groups in Canada. Simard originally wanted to become a police officer. It would have been very easy for him with his build and just the way that he looked. I'm going to insert a picture here of what he looked like just for a comparison. But he originally wanted to become a police officer, but he did have over 80 convictions for smaller crimes like theft, writing bouncing checks, and shoplifting, which made his career as a police officer pretty much impossible. So although Simard played it off as though he was straight, he actually did have a male lover. This man's name was Danny Kane. This was kept quiet because Danny Kane actually had a wife and 2 kids at home. Kane was also a contract killer for the Hells Angels, and he was also an informant for the RCMP, and his family was completely oblivious to all of these things. But Simard was often found driving Kane to and from his RCMP meetings. However, Simard was a notoriously bad driver and actually crashed Kane's car a couple of times. So in February of 1997, Simard shot a drug dealer and his girlfriend in Quebec City because they owed the Montreal Rockers some money. Later, but still in February of 1997, Simard and Kane received an order to go to Nova Scotia to murder a drug dealer named Robert McFarlane. Because he owed the club some money as well. On the way there, they were stopped by the police with suspicion of smuggling drugs, and although no drugs were found in the vehicle or on the people, they did get a silent hit when running their names, which a silent hit occurs when a police informant has a run-in with any type of authorities. So that obviously made them a little bit suspicious as to why a police informant from Quebec was in Nova Scotia, but nothing really came of that. So they just moved on, went on their way. On February 27th, Simard and Kane followed McFarlane home from work. McFarlane realized that he was being followed in a car and got out of his own vehicle and started to confront Simard and Kane on why he was being followed. So Simard then opened fire on him from his vehicle and shot McFarlane, but only wounded him. So McFarlane started to run away screaming, obviously. So this is when Kane and Simard got out of their vehicle and followed him. Simard finished off the kill, and Kane made 2 shots, but he made sure that they were non-fatal so that he could tell the RCMP that he was not the one who killed McFarlane. After this was finished, Simard and Kane went back to Quebec. Simard went back to kill the witness from the first shooting of the drug dealer and his girlfriend. Simard was then, shortly after, instructed by Gregory Woodley, who was a member of the Hells Angels, to kill a man named Jean-Marc Casey in Montreal. Simard killed Casey as he was walking out of a hockey arena and then hid the handgun in a locker in a pro gym nearby. The police found the gun and Simard was caught when he went back to go retrieve that gun from the pro gym. After being arrested, Simard was offered a plea deal. He was facing life in prison without parole. The plea deal would allow him to be eligible for parole after 12 years. obviously he took this deal. The condition was that he would plead guilty and testify against some of the other Montreal Rockers and Hells Angels. So Simard, however, was a terrible witness, according to multiple people. Apparently he was just too stone cold and remorseless in his testimonies. Actually, when Gregory Woodley was being tried for the death of Jean-Marc Casey, the trial was actually acquitted because Simard's testimony was just so useless. When Simard got to prison, he reported that prisoners tried to pick fights with him constantly. Due to Simard's fear of retaliation, he asked for a new identity as a part of his plea deal. Instead of receiving it, he was denied the new identity and was left alone in the general population as a known police informant who betrayed his gang. Simard felt that even though he was a protected witness, that his life was in danger every day because of the circumstances he was placed under. He reported often feeling like a hunted man in prison. Simard requested to be sent to the Prince Albert Institution in Saskatchewan just a few months before his death in 2003 because he thought that he would be safer from the Hells Angels in Saskatchewan than in British Columbia. Once he arrived in Saskatchewan, a couple weeks before his death, the guards were actually warned that there would be some sort of gang trouble and that Simard and a few other inmates would be targeted specifically. On July 18th, 2003, Aime Simard was found dead in his prison cell with 187 puncture wounds caused by a sharpened metal rod. At the time of his death, Simard was set to testify at the trial of another gang member in the near future. There was a trail of blood leading from Simard's cell to the cell next to him, which belonged to Alvin Starblanket. Starblanket had accepted a $25,000 contract to kill Aime Simard. Starblanket pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life with parole after 13 years, and his co-accused was originally charged with first-degree murder, but instead was charged with second-degree murder after the trial. So to get into a couple of theories, we're going to start with Sykes' theory about the pains of imprisonment. He specifically talked about the loss of liberty, lack of access to goods and services, access to heterosexual relationships, a lack of personal autonomy, and a lack of security. So obviously all of those would apply in this case except for the access to heterosexual relationships, because Simard was in a relationship with Danny Kane, who was a man, which implies that he didn't really have much interest in women regardless. However, all other aspects that Sykes brought up were applicable to Aime Simard's situation. He didn't have any sort of liberty in prison. He had no sort of freedom or anything, and that was imposed by the government, the guards, and the other inmates. He didn't have any of the supports or other things that he would have had on the outside. He had no personal autonomy and had people constantly telling him where to go and what to do, such as going to trial and testifying against very dangerous people. And he definitely did not have any personal security, which is evident in the fact that he was denied a new identity and left unprotected and unsafe, even though he was supposed to be a protected witness by the government. According to Ricciardelli, there is an inmate code to limit risk and ensure order within and between inmates. The first two rules of this code are don't snitch and be dependable but not loyal. Simard was very clearly breaking the first two rules of this code, and everybody knew it. He knew it, the guards knew it, the police knew it, and the other inmates knew it. Yet he was still denied a new identity and was placed in general population to be picked apart by the people who despised him. This was also very clearly a violation of his personal security, as mentioned earlier, and even though he was a prisoner, he was still a person, and he was supposed to be under the protection of the government. If the government can't be trusted to honor their word when simply protecting an inmate from death in their own institution, especially considering that someone being restrained and stabbed 187 times could not have been a very quiet act. It seems as though the situation was likely just ignored by the guards, or they weren't watching, because there is no way that this could have gone completely unnoticed, especially considering that they knew that he was going to be susceptible to anger from other inmates, and they were even tipped off that he was going to be attacked specifically, and yet they weren't keeping an extra eye on him to make sure that he was safe in his circumstances. There could have been other reasons behind this, such as staff shortages or overcrowding, not having enough staff to be able to watch him specifically, or having just way too many inmates where the staff wasn't able to account for them all. Those could have been possible problems as well. However, there were no reports of that. So as of right now, it just seems like a case of negligence on the part of the guards. Crew also spoke about the pains of imprisonment a lot, and he spoke specifically about how the pains of imprisonment can be caused by uncertainty and psychological assessment and stuff like that, and how there was a shift from punishment of the body to a punishment of the mind, which I also think could have been very applicable in Simard's case as well, especially considering that he was in there for murder, which is a very, very big charge, and that he betrayed his gang and betrayed the people around him. So the guards could have taken offense to those types of things and either been affected by the fact that he was in for murder, or affected by the fact that he was in and betraying his gang in the process. And in that sort of thing, they could have done some sort of psychological punishment that came from them not providing the protection that he needed as a punishment for what he had done in the past. You would consider that people would be fine with just him doing what he's doing because, first of all, this is their job, and second of all, because he's already serving a punishment for what he had did, which is being in prison. Being denied those things could definitely have been considered a type of psychological punishment as opposed to a physical punishment, because those things will mess with your head. And especially being paranoid all the time, even though it was for good reason, being paranoid all the time is an exhausting thing to be thinking at all times of the day. So to be having to watch your back and be paranoid and anxious and feel all of those feelings constantly, that is a type of psychological torture, because although he wasn't in any solitary confinement, he was 100% alone. He did not have anybody in that prison. He did not have the guards on his side. He did not have the government on his side. He did not have his outside friends on his side, and he did not have the other inmates on his side. He was 100% alone, and that sort of solitary aloneness can really affect somebody as well, which is why solitary confinement is used so often as a punishment for people who are in prison, because it's so effective. Lacking that sort of meaningful human contact with other people is something that's really, really bad for a person's mental health as well. It's not beneficial to them, and not having access to that harms a person mentally and can induce terrible things such as schizophrenia, paranoia, anxiety, depression. All of those mental illnesses can be brought on by loneliness and paranoia and anxiousness and all of those feelings. It can turn into a mental disorder. And those things really affect people as well, because mental disorders are harmful, just like physical disorders, and they will cause the same amount of harm. So being separated and sort of in a solitary confinement and not having anybody around you and being mentally punished by everyone around you, that will ultimately have an effect on you as well. And if he wasn't killed that day in 2003, he probably would have gone into a deep fit of depression and probably would have ended up committing suicide regardless. So to relate some of these concepts together, I think that Crew's pains of imprisonment, talking about the psychological aspects and psychological punishments that he would have gone through, and the whole uncertainty aspect, combines really well with Ricciardelli's inmate code, because don't snitch and be dependable but not loyal, those both apply very, very well to the fact that he was completely alone and completely in solitary, which is another psychological form of torture. Being alone and in solitary confinement can be considered a type of torture. And if people thought that he was a snitch and thought that he was not reliable, that would have kept inmates even farther away from him, and it would have ostracized him a lot more, considering that people not only didn't like him, so they weren't being his friend, people were actively avoiding him because they didn't want anything to be caught for him to be able to snitch on them for. So I think that those two concepts tie together a lot as well, because if people were actively avoiding him, that only adds to the fact that he was actively being punished psychologically, and that could have only made the situation worse. So when it comes to that, I think that those ideas combine and tie in very, very well. Aime Simard had a difficult run after being caught and charged for his crimes, where he felt like there was no one on his side and that everything was being stripped away from him. His liberty, his autonomy, his security, and a lack of his regular resources all left him completely vulnerable to the anger from the other inmates around him. He was bullied and berated in prison. He was constantly in danger, and despite requests to improve his personal safety, whether they were granted or not, he was still killed while in prison and while under protection of the government. So clearly his case was a miscarriage of justice that should have been paid more attention to at the time and can now be used as an example of what not to do. So obviously I spoke about Aime Simard's case. I spoke about Sykes' pains of imprisonment, Crew's pains of imprisonment, and Ricciardelli's inmate code. I tried to elaborate on what I could to talk about how rough Simard's actual prison experience was, because even though it didn't seem like it was rough that whole time, he went through a lot in that time, and it would have affected him very seriously in a very serious way. So even though he did commit the crimes that he did and he decided to testify against people, it was a mistake on the government's part to put him in general population where he was completely vulnerable, and he should have never been put in that position in the first place. So his death, in my opinion, was a completely unnecessary one. It was 100% avoidable. It was 100% unnecessary, because you know that inmates do have a tendency to be violent occasionally, especially if there is money involved. If they know that they're going to get $25,000 for killing this man in prison, they are going to do it regardless of whether it causes more prison time or not. So to put him in a situation like that was completely unnecessary and irresponsible, and it shouldn't have happened in the first place. So there was really no reason, no solid reason that Simard should have died other than negligence and being irresponsible.